This is BBC World News. I'm Kasia Madera. On today's Global, the first draft of a potential agreement at the COP26 climate change conference is published. It urges countries to strengthen their carbon emissions targets within a year and to give poorer countries more support. While the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson arrives in Glasgow, he'll be urging countries to pull out all the stops as the summit enters its final days. Well, the Prime Minister will be holding a news conference within the hour, and of course we will be bringing that to you live. And a little later here on Global, thousands of migrants remain at the European Union's border with Belarus. Those caught up in the crisis tell their stories of how they managed to cross into Poland.
He cut the check.
Who cut it?
Belarus soldiers. And say go to Poland.
And more arrests in Ethiopia. Now the UN's World Food Programme is targeted. More than 70 of its drivers are detained by authorities. Hello and a very warm welcome to Global. The British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has returned to the COP26 climate change conference in Glasgow to push for progress as it enters its final days. The United Nations has just published the first draft of a potential agreement. The document expresses alarm and concern that human activities have caused around 1.1 degrees Celsius of warming to date. It urges countries to revisit and to strengthen commitments to cut carbon emissions within the next year. Well, nations are also being asked to phase out coal and fossil fuel subsidies. We begin our coverage with our environment analyst Roger Harrabin, who reports from Glasgow.
The Prime Minister left his jet on the tarmac as he boarded a train back to Glasgow this morning. Officials believe his presence at the conference will remind other leaders of the concern they expressed when the meeting began. This document is the first draft of what COP26 will finally achieve. It notes with alarm and concern the ever-growing rise in global temperatures. Coal is under attack in the document. It's the dirtiest fuel. The paper proposes phasing it out. It doesn't mention any date, but there will be a big pushback from coal-dependent nations. Oil and gas are under the spotlight too. The document says subsidies for them should be ended. There'll be a fight over this proposal. On the plus side, the poorer nations on the front line of climate change welcomed a plan for increased funds to help them adapt to climate-driven weather extremes.
The doubling of adaptation finance, which is now being proposed, is very welcome. It still isn't enough, but we will welcome what is coming because the impacts of climate change are much, much bigger happening all over the world, including my country, Bangladesh, and we're going to need a hell of a lot more money than just what they're offering right now.
With the Earth getting relentlessly hotter, it's accepted that this meeting won't produce the level of emissions cuts needed to hold temperature rise to the UN's recommended maximum of 1.5 degrees. So nations are being urged to come back next year with more ambitious targets.
What's lacking is political will. We've got the technology, we've got the money, we've got the science. All that's missing is the political will. I'm excited that there's so much pressure coming from outside. I think climate change is on people's minds in a way it never has been before. But now the focus is on the politicians. They now have to step up.
So that report by Roger Harrabin. Now, we are expecting the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson to speak within the hour. So the moment that he does, we will bring that to you live. But we are going to cross over to Glasgow now to speak to Rebecca Morell. Rebecca, you've been at the summit for the past days. You've been assessing all that's been going on, a very busy period for you. When it comes to this first version of this draft, what kind of reaction have we seen? Because we've heard words like alarm being used and also concern.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, the answer to that is it kind of depends who you ask here. There are so many different voices represented at the conference. I mean, the thing I would say is this is a draft. There are going to be lots of drafts in the next few days as they edge towards an agreement. And the challenge, of course, about these UN climate conferences is you have to get nearly 200 countries with very different economies, different problems and different agendas to agree that there's been sort of a lot of push and pull on this already. You know, the agreement mentions phasing out coal and stopping fossil fuel subsidies. Well, countries like Saudi Arabia aren't going to like that very much. There's the issue of help for developing world countries who are suffering the worst impacts of climate change. What kind of recompense do they get for that? Well, the developing world countries say what's being offered isn't enough. And then some of the other countries say, well, we don't want to pay up either. So it's all to play for here. But I think it's quite interesting having this sort of these sort of words in front of us. People have really been poring over them here. You know, every single word, every single sentence. And what's interesting is kind of what's in there, but also what isn't in there too. So it's been kind of lots of people kind of hunched over this piece of paper today to try and kind of figure out what it all means. But it is the first draft. It will change.
So we're expecting it to change, and we're expecting leaders to re-meet again next year. So was that on the cards?
Well, they meet every year at these climate conferences, but next year it now looks like, if this goes through, because remember it's in a draft, that they'll have to come back next year with tougher pledges, kind of harder promises about how they'll cut their emissions. Now, what we know at the moment is to try and stop temperatures from going above 1.5 degrees Celsius, which takes us into dangerous climate change. We need to cut our emissions massively. We need to cut them by 45% by 2030. At the moment, if you toss up all of those promises, the emissions actually rise in 2030 by about 14%. So the promises and the action aren't quite tallying up at the moment. But what's quite interesting about coming back next year, even though it seems a long way off to do this all again next year, well, actually, it was going to be in 5 years' time. So this is sort of an improvement. It's kind of shrinking that time for countries to come back. But whether that gets through to the final agreement, who can say? There's a lot to wrangle over here in the next few days.
Well, Rebecca, as always, thanks so much. I know you've been there for the past few days, sterling efforts there, and we're going to pick up on that positive note. We'll end it on that because we are expecting in just the next half hour to hear from the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson. Of course, it's the government that has been hosting this summit. He is arriving in Glasgow. He arrived in Glasgow actually a short time ago, and we are expecting him to speak on that first version, as Rebecca was saying, of that draft, and a lot more push and pull, a lot more negotiations, no doubt, still underway. Stay with us here on BBC World News. Now, we're going to turn to the escalating migrant crisis on the Poland-Belarus border. EU ambassadors have held emergency talks, and they have declared that the way that Belarus is encouraging migrants from the Middle East to enter Poland can legally be considered a hybrid attack, and this could now be the basis for a new round of sanctions against the country. Belarus is accused of orchestrating the chaos with Moscow's backing, and they're accused of doing so in retaliation for EU sanctions against President Lukashenko's regime. This is something that Belarus and also the Kremlin have denied. Well, meanwhile, at the border itself, thousands of people have spent days in freezing conditions. They want to cross to the Polish side and to enter the EU. Poland says that there were more attempted crossings overnight, and a state of emergency has also come into force in neighbouring Lithuania, which says it is also struggling with the surge in illegal migration from Belarus. Poland says that it has now deployed around 15,000 troops to their border. Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki accused Belarus of state terrorism and said that this was an attempt to destabilise the EU. Well, Mr. Morawiecki held a meeting with the EU Council President Charles Michel earlier, and he called on the EU to block flights from the Middle East. Well, our correspondent Nick Beek is near the border between Poland and Belarus.
Well, this is the main road to Belarus. The border is just over the horizon, but this is about as close as we can get this morning because a state of emergency remains in place. That means journalists can't get to the border area, and crucially, aid agencies and charities cannot reach the people who are now trapped between Poland and Belarus. We think there are maybe up to 4,000 people who have spent a second night in the forest in sub-zero conditions, and obviously there are concerns about their welfare. We heard overnight that two groups of people were able to break through the fence and get into Poland, get onto EU soil. We're not talking about hundreds of people. We think maybe groups of dozens of people. That's even though there are now 15,000 Polish troops and police guarding the border. And what Poland is saying is that Belarus, and specifically President Lukashenko, is weaponizing migrants by attracting them to his country and then sending them down to the border and trying to push them into the European Union. That they're being weaponized, these civilians. He denies that, but the European Union and NATO is backing Poland, who are using very strong tactics, not letting people through. And actually the Polish Prime Minister has accused President Putin of Russia of masterminding all of this. He denies that. But in terms of what happens now, it's hard to tell. Just as we see more police coming back from the border, the operation here, the security operation, continues. But in terms of finding a solution for the thousands of people who are now stuck in the cold, we're no way near to finding that. And as I say, lots of people are concerned for them and what will happen to them in the coming days.
So that was Nick Beek, and he's on the Polish side. He's not right next to the border because, of course, there is a state of emergency there. But in a few moments here on Global, we will be hoping to speak to somebody who lives within that area, within the state of emergency. So stay with us for that, because we'll get a first-hand account of what is happening. Now, turning to those people who have made it across the border, well, they're being taken to migrant reception centres. We're going to hear from two Syrian migrants who are currently housed in the town of Białystok, who told us how they managed to get to Poland.
The last car which took us to the border, they go through the forest, then he drop us, and tell us that there is the border, 500 meters facing you, you just cross.
He cut the check,
Who cut it?
Belarus shoulders, and say go to Poland.
Now, these are some things that Belarus has been actually denying, that they're helping the migrants cross over the border into Poland. This morning, earlier on today, Russian and Belarus foreign ministers met in Moscow. They both of these sides blamed the EU for the situation. So my colleague Steve Rosenberg has more for us from Moscow.
Well, Russia continues to signal support for Belarus. There's been military support. Russia dispatched 2 strategic bombers to patrol Belarusian airspace today. There have been messages of support from the Russian foreign minister, from the Kremlin today. Moscow making it clear that Russia and Belarus are basically on the same page here as regards this crisis. And so Belarusian and Russian officials claim that this crisis has nothing to do with Moscow or Minsk. They blame European leaders going back to the 2015 migrant crisis in Europe, and they blame European leaders today for not allowing these migrants into the EU.
So that was Steve Rosenberg speaking to us from Moscow. And a little bit later on here on Global, we'll be speaking to Mateusz Wodziński. He's a resident of one of the small villages which is within the state of emergency on the Polish side. So we'll be able to get his account of what has been happening. So do stay with us for that. Now we're going to turn to Ethiopia. The UN is saying that more than 70 drivers working for the World Food Programme have been detained by the Ethiopian government authorities. The north of the country is facing an immense humanitarian crisis amid civil war and famine. UN trucks were blocked in the Afar region, in a town on the only route through which aid can be delivered to millions of people in the Tigray region. Fighting between government and rebel forces, as well as roadblocks, has prevented convoys entering for around 3 weeks. Well, Human Rights Watch says that a government-imposed blockade on the Tigray region is preventing women who have been raped during this one-year conflict from getting the medical care that they so desperately need. Well, let's cross over to Nairobi. We can speak to Emmanuel Agunza, who joins us now. Emmanuel, we're hearing such very desperate accounts. Just bring us up to date with what the latest is.
Yes, quite a dire situation, particularly for millions of people in Tigray, in the north of the country, who are in urgent need of humanitarian assistance. They've been waiting for weeks, months to get food aid, medicine, and also water. But now, as we can see, these truck drivers have been detained in one of the only areas where they can pass through to get aid to the Tigray region. And this is a cause of concern. The UN says that since mid-October, only 40 trucks of food have been allowed to get into the Tigray region. And in comparison, they need 100 trucks every day to be able to sustain or help the people who are in need. And then this relationship between the United Nations and the Ethiopian government now getting to a very high-low because of the detention of not just these drivers who are critical in delivering the food aid, but also critical in coordinating some of the needs that the people in the Tigray region require following this 1 year long of fighting in that region.
OK, well, thank you so much for bringing us up to date on what is, of course, a difficult situation. Emmanuel Nguza, thank you so much. Lots more coming up here on Global, so do stay with us. We'll be hearing about a couple in the United States who speak of their hell after finding out that they've been given the wrong embryo during IVF treatment. We're going to be hearing from their lawyer.
There's more to investment than money, which is why we don't just invest in business. At the Public Investment Fund, we invest in something far more important. We invest in people. We invest in human ambition, in human futures, in human success. Because we want a brighter future for everyone. Public Investment Fund, funding new human futures.
At C3AI, we're solving previously unsolvable problems. Inventory optimization, predictive maintenance, anti-money laundering, operational readiness, precision healthcare, energy management. C3AI is AI built to transform your business at its core. C3AI. This is Enterprise AI.
Hello and a warm welcome back to Global on BBC World News. A couple in the US have spoken of their hell after finding out that they'd been given the wrong embryo during IVF treatment. Daphne and Alexander Cardinale arranged DNA testing 2 months after giving birth to what they thought was their biological daughter. They tracked the other couple down and then swapped the girls. Well, the Cardinales are suing the Los Angeles fertility clinic, which was responsible. Mr. Cardinale says that they'd already started to bond with the child.
Once we decided to do IVF, we knew it would be a lot, and it was.
It was. We were just hoping it would be successful, as everybody does.
I think we were hoping if at least one of us was genetically related to her, then we could keep her. But I think the biggest fear in all of this is like, am I going to lose my baby?
Well, that was Daphne and Alexander Cardinale sharing their story. We can speak live to Adam Wolf, who is a lawyer representing the family, who joins us live now. They spoke about their hell, but we hear their pain. Just explain to us, for those not familiar with this experience, what happened to them?
Sure, and thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. The Daphne and Alexander Cardinale, like millions of people around the world, went to a fertility clinic in order to have a baby. They were having trouble conceiving naturally. The clinic made an embryo for them, his sperm, her egg, transferred an embryo to Daphne, and 9 months later, Daphne gives birth to a healthy little girl. But much to their surprise, this girl didn't really look like them. They weren't sure what to make of this. So finally, a couple months later, they get a DNA test. The DNA test yields what was their worst fears, which is that this child was not related to either Alexander nor Daphne. To say this is a surprise is an understatement. It will have lifelong consequences for them.
Well, absolutely. In terms of the length of time, you're saying it was a couple of months after they'd had the baby, bonded with the baby, and it's just very difficult to understand how something like this could have happened. They describe it as a hell. It just really sounds like that.
Sure. I mean, it is unimaginable for almost anybody. You know, they went to a fertility clinic which was supposed to transfer their embryo to Daphne. And then they find out that this baby is not genetically related to them. So they, grow this baby, birth this baby. Daphne's breastfeeding this baby. They're raising this baby. And for 4 months, they raise this baby as their own. Now, 4 months later, or 3 or 4 months later, they go to the fertility clinic and they say, we just got our DNA test. This baby is not ours. And the fertility clinic a couple of weeks later says, yep, sorry about that. We gave you the wrong embryo. And as it turns out, the fertility clinic gave their embryo to somebody else. So they had a little girl genetically related to them who was out in the world being raised by complete strangers as well.
So just elaborate on that point. So what happened then? They swapped the children round. It's very difficult as a parent or anybody watching to comprehend how the next steps worked.
There is no playbook for this. I mean, there's no set of rules, no protocol. They ended up speaking with the other family, and Daphne and Alexander met their little girl, their genetically related little girl, on a photo over text message 4 months into her life. Now, they resorted to the legal process. They ended up gaining parental rights to their genetically related child. They had to give up this girl they had raised for 4 months to the other couple, and they effectively had a baby swap.
You put it like that, a baby swap, and yet when you think about the consequences, it just is very difficult to understand how somebody manages to cope with that. As you said, there's no playbook for something like this. How does a mistake like that happen? And I appreciate that this is now a legal scenario. You're the lawyer representing the Cardinales. But how does a mistake like that happen?
Let's be clear. This mistake should not have happened. Apparently, what we assume occurred is that Daphne and Alexander's embryo and the embryo for the other couple were out of the freezer at the same time, and the lab mixed up the embryos. They had both embryos out. They didn't have 2 sets of eyes on these embryos, and some careless employee there switched the embryos and the vials they were in so that Alexander and Daphne's embryo went into a vial that was marked for another couple and vice versa.
Now, given what you're describing and given the huge consequences of this, is anything like this, are you aware of anything like this happening before, coming to awareness before like this?
It's exceptionally rare. The couple of times I have heard about this, it typically is discovered because the babies are of a different race or incredibly different characteristics physically. But how many times do we have babies of the same race, of similar characteristics, being born to couples through a fertility clinic, and they don't know about it? This is highly disturbing. And to me, at least, it highlights the need to have some real regulation, some supervision and oversight of what happens in American fertility clinics.
And I just wonder if you could just bring us up to date. How are these babies doing now?
This has been incredibly hard for everybody. For Daphne and Alexander, this is a nightmare that has not ended and will not end. For their 5-year-old daughter, their daughter who was 5 at the time, she went from being a carefree, happy child, enthralled with her little sister, to having that little sister taken away, ripped away from her. It has produced anxiety and anger, and she no longer hugs and kisses her parents. She doesn't trust anybody. This is the type of trauma that results when you have mistakes at fertility centers.
Well, it sounds like the kind of worst nightmare possible, and it's happening. In terms of the family, thank you so much for talking us through and bringing us the Cardinale's experience, and we wish them the best of luck. But for the time being, thank you so much for speaking us. And I know, Mr. Wolf, you are, this is a legal procedure right now, so thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Lots more, of course, on our website on that particular story. A lot of coverage, as you can imagine, in the press as well. Now, just briefly to Thailand, a court has ruled that calls for reform of the monarchy's role in politics made at a demonstration last year were unconstitutional. It said that 3 of the protest leaders had been trying to overthrow the current system and ordered them not to make similar comments again. Now, let's bring you some good news. Nobel Peace Prize winner and women's rights activist Malala Yousafzai has got married. The 24-year-old made the announcement via Twitter, and she said that she and her family held a small Islamic ceremony at her home in Birmingham in the UK. She described it as a precious day in her life. We wish her and her new husband all the best. Lots more, of course, on our website as well. I'll be back here very shortly because we are expecting the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson to speak soon. His government has, of course, been hosting the COP26 climate summit, so we will be bringing his press conference live on that first draft of the COP26 summit. So we hope to get a reaction as well, and we will be with you in the next few minutes. Stay with us here on BBC World News.